The city's twilight contrasted with the lights of the skyscrapers, but in a forgotten corner, where few dared to tread, lived John Walker. Known by many as the Shadow Detective, John stood out in the investigation of paranormal phenomena, bringing to light secrets others would prefer to leave buried. With an imposing presence and piercing gaze, he was the last hope for those facing the inexplicable. One night, while reviewing reports from his latest cases, a letter arrived at his door. Without a sender, only an old, worn seal suggested a sender who did not want to be identified. The letter's content was simple but disturbing. A secret organization specializing in paranormal activities urgently requested his presence. The mission: to investigate an abandoned asylum, infamous for cruel treatments and abuses committed between the 1930s and 1950s. John, used to receiving unusual invitations, initially hesitated. His mind echoed the warnings of colleagues, the dark reports of other investigations, and the unease that always accompanied the unknown. However, the promise of new discoveries and the asylum's enveloping mystery were irresistible. Something in the letter, perhaps the urgent tone or the sense of imminent danger, piqued his curiosity. Thus, with a decision that seemed guided by both logic and instinct, John accepted the invitation. The fog of mystery enveloped him once more, and he knew that this time, the answers could be more disturbing than he had ever imagined. The path to the asylum was a lonely journey, winding through deserted roads and landscapes forgotten by time. In the distance rose the asylum's ruins, a building that once stood majestic, now reduced to a menacing shell. Surrounded by a dense and oppressive forest, the building seemed to breathe darkness and despair. When John Walker arrived, the cold wind whispered between the trees, as if nature itself tried to warn him of the danger lurking there. The asylum, with its crumbling brick walls and broken windows, stood out like a sleeping monster, waiting to be awakened. The main entrance, a double wooden door, creaked ominously with each gust of wind, as if it were alive. John passed through the rusty gate, feeling a chill run down his spine. Each step echoed in the desolate walls, amplifying the deadly silence that dominated the place. Upon entering, the dark atmosphere intensified. The twilight seemed to envelop him, sucking out any sense of safety. The air was heavy, laden with an evil presence that seemed to slink around every corner. He turned on his flashlight, revealing dusty corridors and abandoned rooms. The smell of mold and decay was overwhelming. As he advanced, John couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. The tension was palpable, almost tangible, pressing on his chest like an invisible hand. Suddenly, a door creaked in the distance, breaking the oppressive silence. John stopped, his senses on high alert. The sound seemed to have a life of its own, reverberating through the walls like a muffled scream. He recorded the noise with his equipment, capturing every detail for later analysis. As he walked through the corridors, distant whispers reached his ears, almost inaudible but clearly present. Indistinct words, laden with suffering and despair, echoed in the shadows. John mentally noted each sound, each murmur, aware that these were just the first signs of what awaited him. At every corner, shadows danced in the edges of his vision, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. He knew he wasn't alone. Something or someone was there with him, watching, waiting. John recorded everything, his eyes and ears alert to any movement, any sign. The asylum, with its dark history and oppressive atmosphere, seemed more alive than dead. Every noise, every shadow, fueled the suspense and fear. John was prepared to face whatever was hidden there, but the growing sense of unease told him that this investigation would be different from all the others. With the flashlight in one hand and a camera in the other, John advanced through the dark corridors of the asylum, each step a mix of courage and apprehension. He knew that to understand what was happening there, he needed to delve into the place's dark history. The search for answers led him to a room that once served as an administrative office. Collapsed shelves and overturned drawers indicated that someone had been there before, but not enough to erase the traces of the past. John began to search through the files, finding old medical records, patient reports, and letters from staff. The documents were dusty and worn by time, but still legible. The first folder he opened contained medical reports detailing treatments that would now be considered barbaric. Electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other inhumane therapies were described in clinical and cold terms. John felt a knot form in his stomach as he read about the tortures disguised as medical care. Next, he found a series of letters exchanged between the asylum staff. Some were simple administrative communications, but others revealed an atmosphere of fear and despair. There were mentions of patients who simply disappeared without a trace. One letter, in particular, caught his attention. An employee begged to be transferred, citing inexplicable activities and a malevolent presence that seemed to haunt the place. The terrifying image of the asylum began to form in John's mind, but one figure stood out among all: Dr. Vincent Blackwood. The name appeared repeatedly in the documents, painting the portrait of a cruel and obsessive man. John found a diary of the director, where Blackwood described his experiments with sick enthusiasm. He believed he was on the brink of great scientific discoveries, justifying the horrors he inflicted on the patients. Blackwood's notes revealed a disturbed mind, obsessed with understanding the limits of the human mind at any cost. In his words, John could feel the coldness and lack of empathy, as if the patients were mere objects for his experiments. The director saw suffering as a means to achieve his ends, a disturbing detail that added a layer of horror to the asylum story. As John read, the tension in the environment seemed to increase. The whispers in the shadows intensified, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The asylum, with its walls steeped in pain and suffering, seemed to respond to his presence, as if the spirits of those who suffered there were trying to communicate. With the historical documents in hand, John knew he had only scratched the surface of the asylum's dark secrets. Blackwood's disturbing past and the horrors he perpetrated were slowly revealing themselves, but there was still much to be discovered. The investigation was just beginning, and John felt that the real terror was yet to come. As the night deepened, John continued his exploration, the flashlight illuminating only small portions of the dark corridors. It was then that he saw it for the first time, an indistinct, almost translucent figure moving along the corridor. The spirit of a patient, trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead. The figure stopped, and John felt a chill that seemed to freeze his soul. Before he could react, the spirit disappeared, leaving only a trail of despair in the air. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He knew that this was just the beginning. As he advanced, the screams of pain and despair echoed through the corridors. John heard voices pleading for help, their words laden with suffering. The sounds seemed to come from all directions, making it impossible to determine their origin. Each scream seemed to pierce his mind, as if the spirits were trying to share their torment. Suddenly, an object fell from a shelf, hitting the ground with a deafening crash. John turned, only to see a book floating in the air before being hurled against the wall. He approached cautiously, picking up the fallen book. It was an old diary of one of the patients, its pages filled with accounts of torture and suffering. The diary's words seemed alive, pulsing with the energy of the suffering they had recorded. As he advanced, more objects began to move on their own. A chair dragged across the floor, as if an invisible force were pushing it. The voices whispered terrifying secrets, words that made no sense but filled John with a primal fear. He began to doubt his sanity, wondering if he was really seeing and hearing these things, or if his mind was playing tricks on him. The sense of danger began to grow. The spirits were not just present. They were becoming aggressive. John felt the hostility in the air, as if the spirits wanted to drive him away, or perhaps warn him of something even worse. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch, trying to reach him, while whispers became screams. In a moment of tense quiet, John felt a cold touch on his shoulder. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The touch, however, left a mark, a feeling of ice that seemed to penetrate his flesh. The spirits were trying to communicate something, but the message was obscure, wrapped in fear and mystery. With each step, the feeling of being watched increased. John knew he needed to continue, that the asylum's secrets were close to being revealed. But the growing aggressiveness of the spirits indicated that he was approaching something truly terrifying, something that even the spirits feared. The danger was intensifying, and John was about to discover that the true horrors of the asylum were not just in the past, but also in the present, waiting to be unearthed. John felt the tension in the air concentrate in a single place, the old office of Dr. Vincent Blackwood. Pushing the heavy oak door, he entered the room that had once been the center of the asylum's dark power. The dimness of the place seemed even denser there, and the air was thick with a sense of latent evil. The office was a mix of austerity and decay. Old furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs, filled the space. On the wall, a portrait of Blackwood watched everything with a cold and calculating gaze. The desk, in the center of the room, was filled with papers and old books, seemingly untouched for decades. John began to search the desk, looking for any clues that could reveal the director's deepest secrets. It was then that he found Blackwood's personal diary. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but each one was filled with meticulous writing. As he flipped through the diary, John discovered something that made his blood run cold. Blackwood had detailed a series of occult rituals. The diary's accounts were disturbing. Blackwood described how, in his quest for power and knowledge, he had turned to black magic. Ancient books of sorcery were scattered around the room, their titles in arcane languages. Strange symbols were drawn in the margins of the pages, each more sinister than the last. John found macabre evidence. Ritual objects, such as black candles, ceremonial knives, and human skulls adorned with runes. In one corner of the office, an improvised altar displayed sinister artifacts, including a chalice stained with dried blood. The symbols drawn around the altar seemed to pulse with an evil energy, as if the room itself was alive with the power of the rituals performed there. As John read more of the diary, a horrible truth was revealed. Blackwood was not just torturing and experimenting on the patients. He was performing rituals to imprison their souls. He believed that by doing so, he could gain supernatural power, prolong his life, and control forces beyond human comprehension. The rituals described were detailed and horrific, involving sacrifices and invocations of dark entities. Each page John turned seemed worse than the last. He read about patients chosen for the rituals, their spirits trapped in eternal agony. Blackwood described the voices he heard, the screams of the patients he considered a sign of his success. He saw pain and suffering as a means to achieve a greater end, his own ascension to absolute power. The revelation of the rituals explained the malevolent presence John had felt since entering the asylum. The spirits of the patients were not just haunting the place. They were imprisoned, held by Blackwood's rituals. They sought revenge, or perhaps just an end to their endless torment. John realized that uncovering these secrets had awakened something even more dangerous. The spirits were not just warning him. They were demanding justice, liberation. And now, aware of the horrors perpetrated by Blackwood, John knew that the real battle was just beginning. The asylum was not just a place of past suffering. It was a battlefield for the lost souls and the investigator who dared to challenge them. Dr. Blackwood's office was shrouded in heavy darkness, the candles casting sinister shadows on the walls. John prepared the Ouija board and began the seance, determined to communicate with the patient's spirits. "If there is anyone here, I'm here to help," he said firmly. The Ouija board began to move slowly. "HELPME" was the first message. The air around him grew cold, and John felt an intense presence. "Who are you? What happened here?" he asked. The response came quickly and desperately. "PATIENTS DR BLACKWOD." The pain and suffering of the spirits became palpable, with voices whispering stories of torture and macabre rituals. The manifestations became violent. Objects flew across the room, shadows writhed, and the candles flickered frantically. "Free us," a voice pleaded. John felt the depth of the spirit's despair. "I promise to help," he replied, feeling the intensity of the suffering around him. The asylum's malevolent presence seemed to react to his promise, making the atmosphere even more oppressive. The atmosphere in the asylum grew heavier with each step John took. He felt that something was about to happen, a malevolent presence more powerful than any other. In the heart of the building, in the room that had once been the director's office, he finally encountered the spirit of Dr. Vincent Blackwood. Blackwood's figure was a distorted shadow, with eyes glowing with malice. "You dare come here?" The spirit's voice echoed, filled with hatred. "This is my domain." John stood his ground, the flashlight trembling in his hand. "I'm here to free the souls you imprisoned, Blackwood." The spirit laughed, a cold and cruel sound. "They are mine, all of them." With a gesture, Blackwood launched a supernatural attack. Books and objects flew around the room, hitting John with force. He felt a crushing pressure in his mind, as if the spirit was trying to break his will. John resisted, fighting against the physical pain and the mental assault. "You can't continue this," he shouted. "Your reign of terror is over." Blackwood, furious, advanced, his words like poison. "I sought absolute power, control over life and death. Even in death, I command this place." The spirit's rage intensified the attacks, trying to crush John with pure hatred and malice. John, using all his training and willpower, began to recite an ancient exorcism he had learned. The sacred words seemed to weaken the spirit, who screamed in agony. "You will never understand what true power is," Blackwood roared. The struggle was intense, with John defending against physical attacks and keeping his mind shielded from the spirit's psychic assaults. Every word of the exorcism he uttered made Blackwood's spirit tremble and weaken, until finally, with a final cry of despair, the spirit was banished, disappearing in a flash of light. The office fell silent, the oppression in the air beginning to dissipate. John fell to his knees, exhausted but relieved. He knew the battle was far from over, but by fighting Blackwood, he had taken a crucial step in freeing the imprisoned souls and ending the director's reign of terror. The instructions for the ritual were described in detail in Blackwood's diary, but the task would not be easy, especially with the hostile environment surrounding him. John headed to the room where the rituals were performed, a sinister area in the asylum's basement that seemed to emanate a dense and oppressive energy. The room was decorated with esoteric symbols and artifacts of occult practices, making the atmosphere even more disturbing. He prepared the space for the ritual, arranging the necessary items: candles, herbs, and the ancient book of rituals. The tension in the air was palpable, and John felt that something was about to happen. With each step, the presence of the spirits seemed to intensify, as if they were watching with hope and fear. As he began the ritual, the atmosphere in the room became increasingly unstable. The floor seemed to vibrate beneath his feet, and the shadows on the walls danced unsettlingly. John recited the ritual's words with a firm voice, but the forces trying to hinder his progress were intense. Strong winds and inexplicable noises filled the space, and the very air seemed to become denser. The spirits of the patients, who had been contacted earlier, began to manifest again. Some appeared relieved, while others were in a state of agitation, expressing a variety of emotions, from anger to gratitude. Each manifestation seemed to fuel the ritual's intensity, making the environment even more chaotic. John struggled to maintain focus, his determination tested by each supernatural obstacle that arose. At the height of the ritual, an explosion of supernatural energy illuminated the room, and a cry of anguish and relief echoed through the asylum's corridors. The space became a whirlwind of light and darkness, and the feeling of negative pressure finally seemed to dissipate. When the light calmed, John realized that the oppressive energy had lessened. He knew that the ritual had been successfully completed, but the sense of closure did not bring the expected relief. There was a persistent feeling that something was still to come, a premonition he could not ignore. With the liberation ritual apparently completed, John felt brief relief. However, the feeling that something was still to come did not leave him. The atmosphere in the asylum remained charged and tense, and a sense of impending catastrophe hung in the air. As John began to prepare to leave, the energy in the room changed abruptly. Blackwood's spirit, now more furious and threatening than ever, began to manifest with terrifying force. The manifestation was almost physical, with the air around John twisting and distorting in response to the spirit's fury. The final battle began. Blackwood's spirit, with an even more powerful and oppressive presence, launched a series of supernatural attacks on John. The walls seemed to tremble, and a series of violent events began to occur. Furniture was thrown, doors slammed shut with force, and a deafening sound of screams and laments filled the environment. John, determined to survive and complete his mission, used everything he had learned during his investigation. He tried to recite protection spells and maintain control over the ritual's energy. The fight was desperate and exhausting. With each attack, he felt the spirit's energy trying to dominate his mind and body, as if wanting to drag him into a state of complete helplessness and despair. The battle culminated in a final explosion of supernatural energy. A wave of mixed light and darkness enveloped the room, and Blackwood's spirit's agonizing scream echoed through the asylum's walls. The force of the confrontation was so intense that the building itself seemed in danger of collapsing. When the dust finally settled, the silence that followed was almost absolute. John was exhausted, his body and mind drained from the fight. However, the relief he expected did not come. He realized that something was terribly wrong. His equipment was on the floor, his notes scattered, but he himself was absent. John had disappeared without a trace. His equipment was intact, but he had mysteriously vanished. The sense of panic and despair was palpable. The malevolent presence seemed to have absorbed John, completing its final revenge and leaving behind a mystery that defied any explanation. With news of John Walker's mysterious disappearance, the abandoned asylum case gained notoriety. The secret organization that had hired John investigated the disappearance, but their searches were fruitless. John had become a legend among paranormal investigators, his last mission remaining shrouded in mystery. Those few who knew the story spoke of John's sacrifice and the incomprehensible nature of the forces he had faced. Accounts of his experience in the asylum and the disturbing visions he had shared before his disappearance became subjects of debate and speculation among paranormal scholars. The abandoned asylum, now darker and more desolate than ever, remained a monument to past suffering and the hidden forces that might still reside in its corridors. John Walker's fate continued to be an enigma, his disappearance an unsettling reminder of the dangers of challenging the unknown and the horrors that may lie beyond human comprehension. The story of the asylum and the missing investigator remained a grim warning about mysteries that could be more terrifying than anyone could imagine.